What's up everyone, welcome to this video. In this video we're going to look at Poetry, which is basically a tool that we can use to manage our project dependencies when using Python. Poetry allows us to install, to specify, and also manage our project dependencies for a specific project. Now Poetry can be used in situations where you want to use specific dependencies for a specific project. That is, even when you're working on different machines or you actually want to make developers use one specific version of our technology, which is interesting. So I hope you get to learn from this video, and without further ado, let us get into learning how Poetry actually works. To get started, we'll have to go to the official website of Poetry, which is at python.poetry.org/docs. Now, on the documentation, we are provided with instructions of how to install Poetry. So we shall scroll down and then we can see the different platforms with the official installer, with pipx, manually, and so on. But for now, what we want to do is to go ahead and use the official installer. So I'll scroll down right here and we are given an instruction for installing on Linux, Mac OS, and WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux. So since I'm on Windows Subsystem line of Linux here, what I'll do is to go and copy this command, and I'll basically go ahead and paste it within my terminal, just like you see right here. Now shall go ahead and enter. So this will go ahead and install Poetry. Now this will basically give us this welcome message, welcome to Poetry. This will download and install the latest version of Poetry, and it will go ahead and install Poetry on our operating system. Now that Poetry has been installed, let's go ahead and create a simple project in which we are going to use it as the dependency manager. So I'll clear my terminal with Ctrl and L. And what we're going to do is to first of all create that project. So what I'll do is to basically ls. So we have a bunch of things right here, but what I need is to basically create a new app. So let's say we are going to create a weather app, or let's say a weather API, something like that. So in here, what I'm going to do is to go within our weather API, and after entering that folder, what I'm going to do is to go ahead and create a new project with Poetry. Now for us to verify if Poetry has been installed within our project or within our operating system, all I have to do is to first run Poetry and then -- version, and then this is going to go ahead. I actually wrote it badly. It's supposed to be a single dash, actually double dash, not 3 dashes, which is Poetry version. So we have installed Poetry version 1.5.1. After installing Poetry, now the next thing is going to be for us to create a project. So Poetry allows us to create a folder structure that's going to be necessary for us to start using it as a package and dependency manager. So to do that, what I'll do is to go ahead and say Poetry. This is going to be Poetry, and in this case we are going to say Poetry new, and then we shall basically call this our weather API. So what this will do is to go ahead and create a package which is weather API in the weather API folder that we've created right here. So if we are to ls, we shall now see that we have this package or this folder called the weather API. Now what I'm going to do is to enter that folder. So I'll say cd weather API, and inside this weather API folder I'm going to open up my VS Code right in there. So VS Code is going to open up within that folder. So there is this thing of checking whether we have a Git repository inside that folder, but we do not have it. So what I'll do is to go right here. So I'm being told to install WSL2, but just going to close that for now. So when you go to our files right here, we're going to notice that some files have been generated for us and folders. One of those folders is the test folder. So this test folder is the one that's going to contain the source code for testing our application that we shall build when using Poetry. We also have a folder that has the name of our project, or the one that we actually gave when we are initializing our project. We have a pyproject.toml file, which is basically a configuration file where Poetry will basically look for configurations as well as a list of dependencies for it to install and manage our dependencies. So if you look into this file, what it is just a file with a bunch of configurations, but each of these are grouped into what are called tables. So everywhere I see this square bracket syntax is what we call a table, and inside there you'll find a bunch of variables, and each of these have value. So the first one is going to be the name, and what this means is under the table tool.poetry we actually have a name, which name is going to be the name of the package that we've created. We have a version, which basically specifies the version of the package, just following semantic versioning, just like you see right here. And we have the description, which is basically a short package description, just to mention something about the project or what it does. A list of authors who basically created this project. So here the author is my name and my email, and then you have the path to the readme.md file, which is basically this file that's created for us right here. Now this list is the information about where the package actually resides. So the package that we are being referred to here is basically the weather API package right here, and all it does is to have an init.py file, which is basically to mark it as a Python package. However, we can also create some files in here. So I can create a file in here, it can be like main.py, and in here I can go ahead and write my code. So I can say print hello and then world. So this will also work. So I can close this for now, but we are going to look at how we can actually go ahead and use that. So when you look into our pyproject.toml, we have basically three tables that we have right here. We have the first table, which is the table for poetry, and this is basically one that specifies the major configurations for our project, and the main ones are the name of the project, the version of the project, a simple description of the project, as well as the list of authors of this project. So it will basically go ahead and pick this from the user who is basically using that specific operating system. And now we can also see that we are going to have the path to a readme.md, but when you go down here, we have another table that is basically for dependencies. So this is where all the dependencies that the project requires to run are going to be included. And now we can actually see that this has our Python version, which is Python 3.10 on this operating system. So it will basically add that as the main dependency, and then it will provide the specific version, or basically constrain it to version 3.1.0. And then the more we install other dependencies that the project will run on, the more this table will actually have more values. So we also have a table for the build system, and this basically describes what our project will need to be built by Poetry. And in this case, we see that this requires us to have Poetry core, which is going to be the main way for Poetry to basically go ahead and build our project. And then you have a build backend, which is basically the path to, or where the object that's responsible for building our project is going to reside. So let's go ahead and try to create a virtual environment and install dependencies in that virtual environment using our simple setup right here. So the first thing we shall have to do is to go ahead and add dependencies to our new project. So for now, what we've done is to create a project, but we do not have a virtual environment in which we can install our dependencies. So for us to be able to list our dependencies, or to show our virtual environments, actually what we shall do is to go ahead in the terminal. For as long as we are in the project folder where we have our current structure right here, we can be able to make use of Poetry. So let's go ahead and say Poetry. And then in this case, what I'll do is env. So this is to do things that are specific to the virtual environments. If you want to find out the virtual environments that you may be using for this project, what we can do is to say pip env, or actually it's Poetry env, and then list. And this will go ahead and list the virtual environments that we have. But currently we do not have any virtual environments right here. So it will basically return an empty list of virtual environments, or return no output at all. So if we want to go ahead and create a virtual environment, we shall go ahead and use poetry and then env. So in this case, if we want to create a virtual environment, we'll have to specify which Python executable or which Python interpreter to use. And in this case, since we have Python 3 on our system, which is a Linux system, we're going to go ahead and say pip, or actually poetry env. I don't know why I'm mistaking it for pip env. So this is going to be poetry env and then use. So this will basically help us to tell poetry to use a specific Python version. And in this case, we are going to say use Python 3. So when I press enter, this is going to go ahead and create a virtual environment on our system. So this virtual environment is going to be created in what is called a cache folder. So a cache folder is where this poetry dependency manager is going to install our dependencies. Now this can vary depending on which operating system you're using. I'm using Linux, so if you're using Windows, it may be stored in another location, and on Mac as well. But on Linux, it will always be in the home folder, /.cache, and then /pypoetry, just like you see right here. So let's look at the way it names the virtual environments. So if you're to look in here, you will now see that we are using the virtual environment, which is found in this location. But if you're to look at the name of the virtual environment here, actually, let's go ahead and try to look at this specific name here, which is weather API, which is the name of the project, and then dash a specific unique string that basically uniquely identifies that virtual environment. And then it will also go ahead and show us the Python version that was created when creating that virtual environment. So it basically means that we can create virtual environments that may have the same name but have different unique identifiers and different versions of Python. And this is actually amazing in the way I see it. So if we go ahead and try to list our virtual environments again with poetry env list, in this case we shall actually go ahead and notice that we are using our weather API blah 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 virtual environment, and it also returns the status of that virtual environment. So in this case we see that our virtual environment has actually been activated. So for now we have a virtual environment. The next thing we're going to do is to install some dependencies within this virtual environment. Now imagine you are building this weather API with, let's say, Fast API, or let's say Flask. Then we would add Flask to our virtual environment by saying poetry, and in this case we shall say add, and then we specify that specific dependency we want to add. Now in this case we can say add Flask, and this will go ahead and add Flask to our list of dependencies. Now the beauty of this is it's first of all going to resolve the dependencies, and then it will go ahead and install them one by one. And after doing that, it will write a log file, which is basically going to be the one that shows the specific versions, or it's going to actually strictly label those specific versions in a certain file, just like we're going to see right here. So if we go back to our files right here, we shall notice that a new file has been created, and this file is our poetry.lock file. So inside our poetry.lock file, what you're going to notice is that it's going to contain a bunch of things, but what it actually contains are the packages, their dependencies, as well as hashes that are specifying that these are the unique versions of these packages, just like you see right here. So we now see some of the dependencies like blinker, click, and now we can see also Flask, and it will also have descriptions of these packages that have been installed. So for us to be able to get some information about these packages, what we're going to do is to go to our terminal. So I'm going to close my poetry.lock file. I'll clear this terminal with Ctrl and L, and what we shall do is to run poetry, and in this case we shall basically go ahead and run poetry show. And what this is going to do is to show us all the packages that are installed with our virtual environment, and it will also show us the versions of those packages, as well as a simple description about each and every package that is being shown within, or whatever package that has been installed within our virtual environment. So this is actually amazing. I mean, you can be able to just say poetry show and it will show you the packages that you've installed and whatever thing they may do according to how it was documented. Now, another thing we may do is to go ahead and try to create a simple application and then be able to run it with poetry. So for us to do that, what I'm going to do is to go back to our main.py file right here. So this is where I'm going to write some sample code that we may use for basically going ahead to run a simple weather API server. So for now we have a print hello world, but if we wanted to actually go ahead and execute a script with poetry, then we'd actually use the poetry run command to help us do exactly that. So for now, let's go ahead and just run our hello world message. So to do that, what I'm going to do is to come right here within our terminal. So for us to run maybe our Python executable, what I'll have to do is to come right here and say poetry. So this is going to be poetry, and we shall just basically come and say run. So if I provide Python 3, it will go ahead and run our Python 3 executable, just like you see right here. But if we wanted to maybe go ahead and use the Python 3 executable that's within our virtual environment to run our file, then all we do is to go ahead and basically say run Python 3 and then specify the name of the module that we want to actually run. So in this case, I'll say run Python 3 and then I'll say main.py. So if we run this, we're now going to see that it's going to go ahead and use our Python 3 script to run our hello world file, just like you see right here. So once we've been able to do that, now for us to be able to actually make use of the dependencies that we have within our virtual environment, what I'm going to do is to go ahead and basically use them. So I'm going to define some route here. So I'll begin by importing the Flask class. So I'll say from Flask, we are going to go ahead and import the Flask class, and then we shall create our app instance. So this will be Flask name. And then I'll basically define or basically do a bunch of stuff. So let's say we are going to define some routes in here. So I'll say app.route, or let's say app.get. And in this case, I'll basically just write this like this. So I'll say def, and then I'll say hello. And in this case, let's say we want to just return a simple message. So shall return, and then I'm going to also import JSONify. So I can come at the top right here and say JSONify. Just in case you don't know how to develop APIs with Flask, I have videos about that. I'm going to leave it at the top right there. So what I'm going to do is to come right here and import the JSONify function, which is basically going to return a simple JSON message. So in this case, I'll create a dictionary, give it a key of message and a value of hello world. And once we've been able to do this, now I'm going to basically run our server by saying if name is equal to main. So in this case, I'll say if name is equal to main, then what I'll do is to go ahead and run our server. So I'll say app.run, and then I'll specify debug equals to true. So at this point, we've created our simple Flask server, and what we need to do is to go ahead and run this with poetry. So for us to do that, what I'm going to do is to come right here, down here, and what I'll do is to go ahead and say poetry. So actually going to be poetry, and then I'll basically run Python 3 and then specify the file that we want to run. So in this case, I'll say main.py. So what this will do is to go ahead and run our server using the specific Python version that we've installed within our virtual environment, as well as the packages that are installed within our virtual environment. So this is actually amazing. If you go ahead and try to basically see our simple response, when you go to our browser, you'll see that this is going to just return a simple message of hello world, which is actually working the way we want this. Now we can also go ahead and do very many interesting things with it. So we can actually go ahead and instead of just running the Python interpreter and then running the file, we can actually run the Flask CLI as well. So you can go ahead and say something like poetry, and then we can run our Flask script or our Flask CLI. Because we have it within our virtual environment, of course, it's going to return the Flask CLI just like you see right here. Now, in case we did things like, let's say, export Flask app being equal to main.py, still you could run the server with, let's say, poetry run Flask, and then you could basically say run, and that will basically go ahead and run our Flask server just like you see right here. So it's not only limited to Flask, it can be done in any way that you may please. So in case you're using Django, you can still use poetry to run your manage.py file, just like I've shown you right there. So this has just been a simple demo of how we can maybe run our code. However, there may be also instances in which you are using dev dependencies. So dev dependencies are those things that you may want to use when developing, but they're not really important as far as the running of the project is concerned. So with or without these tools, we can still have our project running, but they may be important for testing as well as making the code more readable. Now, by saying this, I mean things like linters or formatters or even tools that we use when testing our code. They may be necessary when we're developing, but they may not be necessary when the code is actually running in production. And that's where dev dependencies are going to come in. So if we go within our pyproject.toml file, so inside our toml file right here, what you're going to have is the list of dependencies. Now, since we installed Flask, we can now observe that Flask is being added to our list of dependencies, which is nice. However, we install this in a way that's different because this is actually a dependency that we need for us to run our project. And in case we're installing a dependency that is to be used only in development or a dev dependency, that we may want to command poetry to install it as a dev dependency. So what this is going to do is to create another table right here, which is going to group only those dependencies that are needed for development. So let's go ahead and install PyTest, which is going to be a testing tool to allow us to basically go ahead and test our application. Or we can actually install Black to format our code or anything. So to keep it simple, let's actually just go ahead and install Black. So if we want to install Black as a dev dependency, what we shall do is to go right within our terminal right here and say poetry. So we shall just do the normal poetry add, and then we basically provide the package that we want to install, which is Black. But then you have to go ahead and provide the option for specifying whether this is going to be a dev dependency. So wherever we installed a package, just like we added Flask, it went and installed it straight to our project dependencies. But in case we wanted to install this as a dev dependency, then we'll have to specify that we want this to be in the group, and we want to specify that it's going to be a dev dependency, just like you see right here. And when I press enter, this will go ahead and add Black to our dependencies. Just going to install Black and everything that's needed to run Black, and it will go ahead and write it to our log files. However, when you go to our pyproject.toml, instead of seeing it within our project dependencies, you'll see that a new table has been created right here, and this table actually contains our Black. So Black is going to be in the dev dependencies list, just like you see right here. So the difference is whenever you add a package without this specific argument, it's going to be installed as a project dependency. But when you install it with the group dev option, it will actually go ahead and install it as a dev dependency. It will add it within our pyproject.toml under the table of dev dependencies, just like you see right here. So that's basically how you install dev dependencies within your project using poetry. So if you want to also go ahead and actually do one more important thing, which is to basically go ahead and basically freeze or basically specify that we need one version of the project or the dependency. So most of the times you are using dependencies, but when you add them with Poetry, what it will do is to look for the latest version of that specific dependency and then install that specific version. However, if we want to limit ourselves to the specific version of a certain let's say of a certain dependency or a certain package, then that's where we may want to actually go ahead and describe that specific package version that we want to install in our project.toml file. So the steps are to describe it within our dependencies without having to just add it, and then going ahead to lock it within our poetry.lock file. So let's begin by looking for a package. So let's say we wanted to go ahead and install an old version of, let's say, old versions of, let's say, Pydantic. So if we maybe look for an older version of Pydantic, so what I do is to go ahead and look for an older version of Pydantic. Let me go to releases right here. So this is version 2.1. Or let's say we wanted to actually go ahead and use a version of an earlier version, like let's say version 2.0.2. Let's say we had a project but it basically uses version 2.0.2. So what you may do is to go ahead and basically define that in our pyproject.toml file. So if we head over to our pyproject.toml file, what you have to do is to come and basically provide that dependency. So I'll say we want to use Pydantic and we want to use the specific version, which is going to be version 2. So let's say version 2.0. Let's say was it 3? I think 2.0.2. So after adding this, what we need to do is to go ahead and lock our poetry.lock file to basically specify that we need that specific version. So even when we go ahead and install, it will not install any other version of Pydantic. So if we go ahead and say poetry, and in this case what we need to do is lock, it will go ahead and look for the dependencies of Pydantic, but it will not install them within the virtual environment. So what happens here is we shall basically get Pydantic dependencies, write them to our log file, but then we will not install them within our virtual environment. So to basically go ahead and install, every time we basically specify a specific version, what we have to do is to lock them and then install them. So to install them, what we shall have to do is to just come right here and say poetry, and then go ahead and say install. So what this will do is to install that specific package that we've locked within our poetry.lock file. So this will collect Pydantic core, typing extensions, and then Pydantic. And it will also give us that we have our current project being version 0.1.0. So even when you go back to our, so let's go to our poetry.lock file, we can actually see that our Pydantic has been added. So if we scroll down right here, we can now go ahead and see Pydantic being installed within our virtual environment, just like you see right there. So Poetry is amazing, and quite a lot of things that we can actually do. For example, let's say we want to basically create a requirements.txt file for the dependencies that are existing within our project. Then we can also do that with Poetry and then export, and then you can basically point to the file that you want to export the requirements to. So in this case, I'm going to just say requirements.txt, and that will go ahead and add our requirements. So this is actually going to be no arguments expected for export. I think this is poetry export, and let me have a look at this. If you say poetry export, this is actually going to I think it's going to be the same command, but we'll have to basically specify that we'll have to write all that stuff within our requirements.txt. And now you'll see that this is going to go ahead and create our requirements.txt file right here, which will basically go ahead and write the versions of the Python packages that we want to install, as well as all the hashes for those packages, which is basically to specify the Python version. So I hope you've basically had a look at how Poetry works, which is basically an organized way in which we can manage our dependencies. I hope to start using Poetry as my main dependency manager in my projects, because it's actually interesting and it gives me this vibe of npm. If you've basically worked with Node.js before, then I think you know what I mean. In this video, we've basically got an introduction on Poetry, which is basically a dependency manager for Python that allows us to manage our Python dependencies by installing them, updating them, and also going ahead to create virtual environments and simplify how we work with Python dependencies in our projects. If you've liked this video, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you're new. I also have some more videos about Flask if you're interested. I'm going to leave on the screen right here. So I hope to see you in the next video. Bye. See you soon.